In this session, we're going to be talking about basic customization. As you know, the Windows GUI is the main interface to all the historical data. What I'm going to talk about is every client, every individual using the system can actually customize the interface itself. So right off the bat, you can see, this is the graphing window. This is what we call the navigation window. And of course, this will have the system names for all of the LPARs that you're connected to. And you'll notice that by default, in this case, it's IBMI, it's blue. If you connect it to an AIX system, it would be green. If you connect it to a Linux system, it would be black. You can certainly change those colors. If you'll notice this window here, if you put it here, can get smaller or bigger based on how big your system names are and so forth. That's one slight customization. But what I really wanted to focus on is, the main customization. Again, we're going to talk about basic customization, which are really these two options here. In the next series, we'll talk about advanced customization, which is going to be basically these three options here. Well, let's talk about the system options. And I'm going to go, you can actually shortcut this, but I'm just going to go to dates and it's going to bring up the main window. As you can see, there's system and graphs and the other advanced report sets here, but we'll talk about what these tabs mean. And so there is a fair amount of customization that can be done. A lot of people just take the defaults, unless you're trying to do something specific. Dates, there are really in this section, two dates that are really important. One's called the average day and what if date range. And you can see, and the second one's peak day and service level constraint. And you can see in both cases, it says use the default, which is a month. Now, you obviously can change any one of these. Just say if you wanted to go back 2 months, you just, click the arrow and go back 2 months, for example. That's one way to do that. Now, again, these dates specifically apply to average day graphs or if you're going to do any what if, capacity planning analysis, right? So that's what these two date ranges, or this date range. This date range specifically applies to peak day. So when you go after a peak day graph, you tell Performance Navigator to search, in this case, the last month's worth of data, and find me the day that used the most CPU milliseconds or the highest disk, response time, whatever the metric is, right? So that's what this is. It also has to do with service level constraints. So any of the service level graphs will search this date range to come up with whatever the service level is. So these are two important dates to remember. Now, if you're talking about trending and average days, so remember the average day graphs not only will search this thing, but we also by default do not include Saturdays or Sundays. And this is typically because these are days that people do backups or recovery or upgrades and that kind of thing. So just remember that if you want to include these, you just come in here and you just check these two boxes here. So this has to do with how the trend line gets calculated. So again, by default, it's only Monday through Friday. When you're looking at an average day, it's only going to look at, Monday through Friday, unless you check these two boxes. If you've been a long-term customer, this little data cutoff parameter might be of use. We've had customers for years and years and years, and even though we never throw the history away because it doesn't take up that much space, you in fact may not want to look at it. In other words, you may not want to be constantly zooming in or zooming out or whatever. So this is a way to lessen the amount of data that we're bringing into the client. Think of it as a where clause. So for example, let's say you had 3 years of data, but you only want to look at 2024. Really all you could do is you could actually just type in 2024. It's going to warn you that, hey, are you sure you want to do this? And we'll just say yes. Now you can actually use your arrow keys. I'm going to look at my arrow keys now. I'm just using it up and down to go to, let's say, January the 1st. And there we go. I was using my arrow keys to do this. Now you do not need to check this box. That's only on special for special graphs. Now, if you said okay, what's going to happen is on this system, by the way, when I do an SQL, I'm going to put a where clause on it to say only bring in data from 2024. So that's what these dates are used for. And again, these are all individual customizations. Let's look at the next tab, which is the shift times. This is only used if you wanted to do customized shifts. By default, we have shift one and shift two. As I mentioned before, these are like workload shifts, but we can do customized deep shift defined times. For example, I want to know what my average CPU utilization was between 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock every day. So you could actually do this, and that's what these are. So user defined, first shift, second shift, 24 hours, or and of course, if you user defined, you select whatever time range you want. And this applies only to the user defined graphs, by the way. So the alias tab by default is blank. You can see my name is Flatiron, the production name. Usually this is a lot of default. By default, your system name is the serial number. So unless you've changed that, you might want to say something, for example, like production or development or whatever. So instead of having the serial number as your system name on a graph, you could actually give it an alias like production, so it may be more meaningful to managers. This LBAR tab is was really of no use today because this was developed years ago when we really didn't know exactly what the LPAR configuration was in terms of desired and virtuals and so forth. Today, we actually know this, so this is really only used for really old data on really old machines. So this is probably of no use at this point. The key code is where you're going to enter the key for the product. We do license this product by serial number and LPAR number. So in this case, this is LPAR number 5 and it's on the serial number. This is where you would enter the key to open up all of the options. Just as a reminder, everybody does get 3 free graphs. You get your CPU utilization, your disk, and the daily health check. So there's actually 3 things that you can get just to make sure that data collection is going on and so forth. So a lot of customers, let's say they have a license for production, but we would encourage you to install it on your test and dev petitions and just look at the free graphs, because if and when you ever needed to do something, for example, like capacity planning, you're going to upgrade the machine. It'd be nice to have that historical data. And again, you can look at the few free graphs and systems to make sure the data collection is going on. So that's where you would enter the key code. The password, as you probably know, once you log in the first time you connect to a system, it will ask you to log in. If you have lots of systems, this may become repetitive. So you can actually save the user ID and password to automatically log in. This works great with one big exception. If your organization wants you to change your password every 90 days or so, then this is really not a good idea, because you'll forget, because I would forget, and you'd come up and you're going to wind up disabling your password, your ID, because we're going to try to probably log in 3 times, and after 3 times by default your ID gets disabled, right? What we recommend in those cases is we highly recommend that people with lots of LPARs, they create an ID, and let's just call it PerfNav, that cannot log in. In other words, you cannot have a 5250 session. And you can actually, if you want to have your security team wants to restrict it further, you can say this ID can only have access to 2 different libraries, which is MPG Lab and QPFR data. So, and obviously this ID would have a password that doesn't expire. So you can still probably lock down the password and then make it easy if that's a possibility. Prior CPUs tab is probably not of any use today, which is exactly like the LPAR tab. Depending on how old the data is, we might have had to tell the Performance Navigator about prior CPUs and so forth. So that's probably not in use today. The HA tab certainly is. This applies to when you have your HA, high availability system, that has the same name. So Performance Navigator tracks the system name with the IP address. So let's say you connect to prod and your production prod, and then you say, I want to look at my HA system, which is also named prod. You connected it. Well, we're just going to replace the IP address of prod. In other words, you would only see one system name in here. If you have this situation, connect to your production first, and then check this little box and say system one. And what it does, technically, it puts an underscore one next to your system name. And then you can go connect to your HA system called prod, and then you will see the second prod in your list there. So this is how technically, we could connect up to 4 systems with the same name. So this is what the HA tab is used for. Time zone is really used for capacity planning. As we all know, all of the systems are collecting data, and the clock is going to be the same. But technically, when you're managing a frame, you could have 4 LPARs in a frame, each of those in the 4 different time zones in the US, for example. Now, when you're looking at each individual LPAR, you're going to see, 8 o'clock is 8 o'clock. However, when you're looking at how busy the frame itself is, you you want to really adjust the time zone for each of these LPARs, because obviously, at 8 o'clock on the East Coast time, the West Coast is asleep, right? So the frame is not that busy for the West Coast. So this is where you would adjust this to get a view of how busy, quote, the frame is, when you're looking particularly in capacity planning. Reminders is just a little place for you to put some notes if you wanted to. You have the before and after dates. Um, Performance Navigator does have the capability of doing performance uh, analysis on one date versus another day. We can also do a week versus a week, but you do that with a trend line. But this is where you can actually change the before and after dates. You can actually do this dynamically, with the mouse, looking at pointing to a date and time and right clicking, or you could come to this tab and change the before and after dates when you're doing a comparison. So this is basically a high level for the system tab. I'm going to now come over to the graph tab and kind of go through those selections and explain what these customizations are. Uh, as you might know, obviously, Performance Navigator not only tracks all of your hardware, but it tracks every job and every user, um, every file system, every library. So there's a lot of data that it tracks. So these are selection parameters. So for example, by default, we are looking at in the ASP, so your disk, your sys is 1. But let's say you have 2 ASPs, you have independent ASP called 33. Well, this is where you would change it to say, hey, I want to look at ASP33 instead of ASP1. We can look at individual memory pools. By default, we're looking at the machine pool, which is 1. If I wanted to individually look at pool 2 or 3 or 4, whatever it is, you can actually change it here, right? There's a shared pool ID. We're virtual shared pools. So if you are a customer who has created 2 or 3 virtual shared pools, we have a graph to look at a shared pool, and this is where you would change this. Now, you could also change this in the graph itself. If you remember those 3 little lines that are off to the upper right-hand corner of a graph, that will let you change it as well. But this is up, ultimately, when you do it from there, we're actually changing it in this interface. It was, as I mentioned before, we do track every job and user and subsystems and groups. You can create a group of jobs or whatever, and we'll talk about that in the advanced section in the next video. But this is where you would enter a job name or a subsystem name or a group name. And then in the graph job subsystem tree, menu tree, you can actually then say, tell me the CPU utilization of any given job or use a subsystem or group. Now, as a reminder, that menu tree uses what we call the interval file, which goes back by default 90 days of history. So, and you can drill up to get averages like by the date, or you can drill down into the time and actually see what happens on each interval. So this is how you would select what job or subsystem. And the same goes for all the rest of these fields. You can say, I want to track a user, give me a user ID or a group. I'm going to graph a particular library or a group of libraries. I want to look at a different object. I can do that, or a different stream file, or a file system, which is an AIX parameter. Uh, a job accounting code. If you use job accounting code, you can say, show me a picture of this accounting code. Line name. If I want to look at how busy a particular Ethernet line is, this is where you give us the line name. And there's a Domino server, which obviously we don't see very often anymore. There's an HTTP server. So this is technically, any Apache HTTP server. If you give us a name, we can tell you uh, about. There's a menu tree to look at that particular server. If you're using WebSphere, this is WAS, the WebSphere server, same thing. The disk arm, we can actually look at an individual arm, or we can look at a group of arms, like for example, arm size. Tell me how busy my disks are above X, percent size, and so forth. The interactive pool, the batch pool, so forth. Now, the bottom part is they think of it as a third date, right? This is what report dates and times. So sometimes you can create a report and it will use this date range instead of those other two date ranges we saw in the system tab, which are the average day and the peak day. So this is basically used for reports. The one thing to mention about all of these selection parameters is there is no and clause. In other words, you can't say show me job number X with user ID this. So they're all independent of each other. So that, just remember, there's really no and clause in any of these variables here. The advanced tab gets into, for example, if you might remember, there's an extrapolation button. In other words, based on your trending, you can extrapolate your CPU utilization of your disk or any metric, basically. Now, we do have this by weeks and months. So by default, you can see we're going to be extrapolating 13 weeks. By the way, if you have a graph by date, it actually uses the by week parameter. And so, it will extract it. So like if you had a graph by date and you wanted to go out, let's say 6 months, you could certainly type in here, 180 days or something like that, right? And it would extrapolate it. The y-axis, you can set the maximums. You could set the report CPU millisecond limit. So what this is, by default, when we show you a lot of jobs, sometimes just to any job that uses less than, in this example, the default's 1,000 milliseconds, we actually don't show you because it eliminates a lot of jobs that really don't probably mean anything. So again, we're usually in a problem determination mode at this point. We can do, I'm going to say, higher graphic capabilities like histogram classes. There's 15 of them. We can do moving averages. We can modify the intervals per day. We can do like the 95th percentile. We can draw a line to do that. And of course, if you do that, you can have a moving average or a centered average. So this gets into a lot of mathematics, depending on how technical you want to get, with your graphing and your trending, so forth. A lot of customers do use this one because we do automatically adjust the Y scale on CPU graphs, or in fact, a lot of graphs, but let's talk about CPU for a second, to the data. So let's say your test dev machine is only 20%. When you first bring it up, the top line's probably going to be at around 30%. So that you can actually see the graph because it's not that busy. However, a lot of customers say, hey, I want my graphs to be standard. In other words, always be 100%. So this is how you could force the graph, regardless of the data, to be, for certainly CPU graphs to be 100%. Save the graph with a date in them. So you can save any graph if you want. And if you want, if you don't check this box, they all have default names. And if you save it on Monday and you save again on Tuesday, it's just going to override it. So if you want to keep the dates, this was actually one way of doing it is this, because we put the date in the file name. We can scale it by time, which by default is on. Allow green scroll arrows by double clicking. So remember, when you're at the time level, you can scroll through the days, but you can allow just to double click and scroll that way. This is if you're only an MSP, which is a managed service provider. This has to do with getting enterprise reports. So if you are a managed service provider and you're interested in setting up a customer dashboard, this is one of the check boxes, and some more options will show up so that you can actually perform this, right? You can change the date format if you want. This is really advanced. This has to do with what if. One of the unique features in what if is that we automatically adjust to the time. So let's say you're consolidating 10 LPARs, and 5 of those are in 15-minute intervals, and 5 of those are in 5-minute intervals. The what if product function actually takes care of that and normalizes the data regardless of how it's collected. Uh, in this case, what this is saying, I want you to normalize it to 15 minutes. You could say I want to normalize it to 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 1 minute, so forth, or 60 minutes. So this is basically a what if average day function here. So that is the advanced stuff. If you go in here to fonts, you could actually change the font if you wanted to, like the title and the x-axis, or the tick marks, legend, and spacebar. So this is sort of, again, customization. That technically you can change the background color. As you can see, the latest version, it's sort of a white or an off-white. If you wanted to have it shaded, or if you actually wanted a picture or something, you could actually do that if you wanted to. So that's gives you the capability to do that. You can actually put a subtitle in the system. So remember, you have the option to make an alias. Well, an alias actually changes the name. So in my case, it would be flat irons. It would actually change it to, let's say, production. Here, you could put a subtitle instead. So you could say flat iron, and it's actually going to be a third row in the title that actually would say production. You could put the model name, you could put the model in the graph title if you wanted to as well. That's what this is for. The service guidelines and service levels tab, technically these are the defaults. Most of the graphs have automatically defaulted guidelines. So this is technically a way you could actually change the default. So a lot of the power analytics graphs, they are going to produce management reports, which means the cell themselves, like when you're reporting CPU busy, will be green, yellow, or red based on these guidelines, right? So this gives you the opportunity, if you can technically tweak these guidelines if you wanted to. I'd highly suggest you call support if and when you do that, just so you know what the impact would be. As you can see, there's actually 4 different guidelines, if it will, and it sort of depends on what metric. For example, disk utilization is a good one. You can see, obviously, the longer time you have averaging, you're averaging things. So in this case, we lower the guideline because you're averaging. So this is why if you're looking at interval, it's 15 and 14 and 12 and 10, right? Here it's 1 1 1 1. It's response time, so it sort of doesn't matter, how much data you're averaging. So the guideline should be the same for space. So that's a good example. The LPAR tab, again, it's probably of no use at this point, except for when you're doing an all LPAR graph. If you wanted to only graph the total, you could do that versus breaking it out by LPAR. So most people are going to want to break this out. So this option is not used very often. You can also do the time zone adjustment when you're doing this, right? Now, output directories, this could be very important. So the top one is save the graph, which technically is the last place you save the graph, like to your C drive or F drive or whatever. The report output, you can see both the report output and the expo are default, and that is the default for the system. Again, technically, you can put this anywhere you want. So think of this as the global directory. So you can, when you create what's called a report set, which we will get into in the next video, which is going to be the advanced customizations, it basically can override where you save the output. So a lot of times I would just suggest leaving this where it is because this is a global output. And then when you automate the whole process of saving output and so forth, you can actually do that through what we call a report set. And that way you don't have to leave these alone. The Expo is another form of dashboard. And again, you can actually change where that goes, but until we get into the advanced thing, we'll leave this. So this is sort of how you would do that. So that's really a quick overview of the basic navigation and basic customizations. In the next video, we'll talk about report sets and groups and reporting framework and so forth. Thanks again for watching, and I look forward to you watching the next one. Appreciate it. Thanks.